The desolate landscape stretched on, a sea of jagged rocks under a blood-red sky. Lieutenant John Carrick moved steadily across the terrain, his mind focused on the task at hand. His orders were simple: survey the abandoned outposts, scan for any alien technology, salvage what could be useful, and return. But as Carrick trudged through the dust-filled air, something broke the monotony. A glint of light, a glimmer on the horizon that caught his eye. He squinted, the figure slowly becoming clearer as he approached. What initially seemed like debris turned out to be something else entirely. It was large, much larger than anything he'd expected, sprawled across the barren ground. His first thought was some remnant of an ancient alien civilization, a scrap from a warship maybe, or discarded machinery. But as he closed in, a different realization hit him. This wasn't debris. It was alive. The creature was massive, its body sprawled across the rocks, with scales that shimmered under the faint light, each one layered like the plates of armor on an ancient beast. Carrick's breath caught for a moment, and his instincts urged caution, yet he didn't step back. The creature's head lay tilted against the ground, eyes half shut, its breathing ragged. He could tell it was weak, dying even. But what struck him most wasn't its size or the ferocity it hinted at. It was the smaller figure lying close by, a much younger version of the creature, clinging to the giant's side, as if protecting it. For a moment, Carrick considered leaving. This was a survey mission, not a rescue. And whatever this creature was, it looked like it could crush him with ease if it regained its strength. But then he caught sight of its eyes, barely open, their depth revealing a startling intelligence, a consciousness that resonated in ways he didn't fully understand. Carrick felt something, a pull, maybe, or a whisper in his mind urging him to stay to help. He lowered himself, slowly closing the distance between him and the creatures. The child watched him with wary eyes, clearly exhausted but unwilling to let go of the creature beside it. Carrick took a canteen from his belt, pouring a small amount of water into his hand. Gently he held it out, showing the larger creature he meant no harm. To his surprise, it slowly moved its head, extending a long, scaled tongue to lap up the water with visible effort. "All right," he murmured softly. "Let's get you sorted." The creature's breathing steadied slightly, and its eyes tracked his movements, alert but no longer fearful. He noticed a crude, unfamiliar insignia carved into one of its scales, a mark he'd seen before on alien mining ships. Suddenly it clicked. These weren't just any creatures. They'd been used, likely enslaved, by alien forces. The Altan, he recalled, were infamous for their ruthless exploitation of anything they deemed lesser, and these creatures, it seemed, had been left behind like worn-out tools. The notion stirred something in Carrick. He studied the younger creature, noting the subtle differences, a smaller build, a lighter sheen to its scales. This was a family, a parent and child, abandoned on a hostile planet. He'd seen enough to piece together the grim picture: forced labor, and once they'd outlived their usefulness, abandonment. As the larger creature closed its eyes momentarily, Carrick found himself speaking softly. "They left you here, didn't they? Thought you weren't worth the effort anymore." His voice carried a mixture of empathy and disdain, aimed not at the creatures but at their captors. The creature's eyes reopened, fixing on him as if it understood every word. A deep, rumbling growl escaped its throat, not aggressive, more a sound of acknowledgement. It shifted slightly, revealing a thin trickle of blood along one side where scales had been broken, likely from trying to protect its young one in harsh conditions. Without a second thought, Carrick reached for a first aid kit, carefully cleaning the wound and applying a salve. In response, the smaller creature nudged closer to Carrick, letting out a low, tentative purr. Carrick chuckled softly, though the situation was far from amusing. "Guess you're starting to trust me, huh?" he muttered. The little one tilted its head, studying him as if weighing his intentions. Carrick sat beside them, resting momentarily, feeling the weight of his decisions bearing down. He couldn't just leave them here, yet taking them would be a direct violation of protocol. His mission was strictly reconnaissance. No unauthorized cargo, no unscheduled delays. But as he looked at the creatures, the decision had already been made, buried deep in his gut. The larger creature turned its head, watching him with something resembling gratitude, or maybe relief. And then, for the first time, it moved, a slow, deliberate gesture as it raised one massive claw and tapped it against the ground, inches from his boots. Carrick hesitated, then extended his hand, pressing it gently against the cool, rough surface of the creature's claw. It was a simple gesture, but it carried a profound message. Trust, however tentative, had been forged between them. Moments passed in silence, only the soft wind and the faint hum of his equipment filling the air. Carrick could feel the weight of their dependence, their fragile lives balanced precariously on his choice. It was strange, he thought, that this sense of responsibility felt heavier than any weapon or armor he'd ever carried. These weren't his people, weren't even his kind. Yet here he was, willing to bend the rules, maybe even break them, for the sake of something as simple as survival. He glanced over at the younger creature, now curled up beside its parent, its eyes drooping with exhaustion. It reminded him of a child, fighting sleep but losing the battle. Carrick's hand instinctively went to his belt, reaching for a blanket he kept rolled up for emergencies. Carefully, he spread it over the smaller creature, watching as it snuggled into the warmth. The creature's parent watched, the faintest hint of relaxation softening its gaze. Carrick couldn't be sure, but he felt as if it was acknowledging his care, perhaps even thanking him in its silent way. The thought left him both humbled and determined. He leaned back, gazing at the red-tinted sky, mind racing with plans. He'd need to figure out a way to get them to his ship without attracting attention, and he had to do it fast. Time wasn't on their side. He could already see the signs of exhaustion etched into the creature's movements. He couldn't abandon them, not when they'd been left here to die, not when they had a chance, however slim, to make it out alive. In that moment, his mission transformed. No longer just a survey or a collection of data points, it had become a rescue. A matter of survival. And he knew he wouldn't rest until he saw it through. "All right, big guy," he whispered, patting the creature gently. "Let's get you both out of here." Carrick kept his eyes fixed on the creatures as he sat close, waiting for their exhaustion to ebb enough for them to move. The smaller creature still looked wary but less so, almost as if it sensed he was different. The parent's breathing had steadied somewhat, though the signs of exhaustion and suffering were unmistakable. There was no way they'd survive another night out here, not without help. Gathering his supplies, Carrick started by offering them more water. The larger creature accepted, drinking with measured sips. It kept its gaze on him, a quiet intelligence flickering in those dark, watchful eyes. As he observed the creature, Carrick noticed something strange about its body language, gestures that seemed almost intentional, as if it was attempting to communicate. He tried to mimic some of its simpler movements, small nods, shifts in posture. Surprisingly, the creature responded, mirroring his nod with a slow blink. A quiet understanding seemed to emerge, unspoken but undeniable. The wind picked up, scattering dust across the barren landscape, but Carrick barely noticed. He was immersed in this unlikely exchange, feeling a strange bond forming. It was only then that he noticed the smaller creature studying him with even more curiosity, leaning slightly forward as if observing the interaction with new interest. Carrick tried a tentative smile, and the little one tilted its head, almost like a child trying to comprehend an unfamiliar concept. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Carrick spotted an insignia on the larger creature's scales, a crude mark, etched painfully deep. It was a familiar symbol, one he'd seen in reports. This was no ordinary alien wildlife. These creatures had been enslaved by the Altan, an alien race notorious for their merciless exploitation of anything weaker than themselves. Carrick felt a surge of anger on behalf of the creatures. To the Altan, they were just tools, used until they broke down, then abandoned like debris. It was painfully evident in the creature's scarred hide, in the exhaustion etched into every movement. The realization brought a surge of resolve. They weren't just innocent animals caught in an alien trap. They were victims of the Althan's cruelty, beings who had been used, discarded, left to fend for themselves on this harsh planet. Carrick couldn't imagine the hardship they must have endured, not just surviving but protecting one another despite the odds. The scars, the malnourishment, they were signs of a struggle far beyond simple survival. And now, seeing them up close, Carrick could sense the depth of their resilience, a strength that went beyond mere instinct. Carrick reached into his pack, bringing out a small nutrient pack he'd reserved for emergencies. Gently, he tore it open, offering pieces to the larger creature. It sniffed the food cautiously, but after a moment of consideration, it took a piece, chewing slowly. The smaller one, too, leaned forward, hunger overriding caution, and accepted a morsel from Carrick's hand. He could feel the trust building, a gradual, hesitant acceptance of his presence. In a way, he was beginning to see them as more than aliens or creatures. These were sentient beings, intelligent and full of hidden strength. Sitting with them, Carrick started piecing together bits of their story from the clues around him. The Altan, he knew, were brutal taskmasters, and they likely used these creatures as labor for mining or exploration, only to abandon them here when they outlived their usefulness. The thought made him grit his teeth. He knew protocol dictated that he shouldn't interfere, but how could he justify leaving them here, knowing the kind of cruelty they'd already suffered? His orders seemed a poor excuse for abandoning lives that had already endured so much at the hands of others. The larger creature seemed to sense his turmoil, its gaze lingering on him as if offering reassurance. Carrick felt his resolve solidify. He wouldn't leave them here. Protocol or not, he couldn't walk away. He was beginning to understand that sometimes rules existed to be broken, especially when lives were at stake. These creatures had known nothing but cruelty and neglect, and now, at their weakest, they deserved a fighting chance. A low rumbling sound snapped him back to attention. The creature was growling softly, its eyes fixed on him with an intensity that conveyed more than simple instinct. Carrick tried to decipher its meaning, sensing urgency in its gaze. As he watched, the creature shifted its weight, raising one claw and pointing it toward a distant rock formation. Carrick squinted, trying to see what it was indicating. In the distance, he could make out faint silhouettes moving, other alien lifeforms, perhaps Altan scouts or scavengers. Understanding dawned. The creatures had been abandoned, yes, but they hadn't been left alone. The Altan likely kept tabs, sending scouts to check if any remnants could still be exploited, or perhaps to ensure the creatures didn't survive long enough to pose a threat. Carrick's mission had just become more complicated, and he was certain those approaching figures meant trouble. Without a word, he moved closer to the creatures, his posture signaling readiness. The larger creature nudged its child protectively, instinctively understanding the need to prepare. The quiet bond they'd established would now be tested. If they had any chance of surviving, they'd have to work together against the approaching threat. Carrick looked at the creature, a silent question in his gaze. It gave a barely perceptible nod, and in that brief moment, an alliance was forged. He reached for his weapon, making a quick assessment of his surroundings. The rocky outcrops nearby could serve as cover, and he motioned for the creatures to follow him, staying low. The larger creature moved with surprising agility, keeping pace despite its injuries, while the smaller one clung close, its eyes wide with a mix of fear and determination. The Altan scouts drew closer, oblivious to the ambush awaiting them. Carrick steadied his breath, waiting until they were within range before signaling the creature. In perfect synchronization, they sprang into action. The larger creature unleashed a deafening roar, its massive frame lunging forward to engage the scouts. Carrick took advantage of the chaos, firing his weapon with precision, picking off targets while the creature's raw power created a formidable distraction. In the heat of battle, Carrick found himself awestruck by the creature's resilience. Despite its weakened state, it fought with a fierce protectiveness, every movement fueled by an instinct to shield its child. Carrick couldn't help but feel a deep respect for its tenacity, realizing that their bond wasn't merely situational, it was born out of a shared struggle for survival. As the last of the scouts fell, Carrick lowered his weapon, glancing over at the creature. It was breathing heavily, but the look in its eyes told him it would fight 1,000 more battles if it meant keeping its child safe. In that moment, Carrick felt a sense of kinship, a recognition that went beyond species or origin. They were both soldiers in their own right, both willing to defy the odds to protect what they held dear. With the immediate threat eliminated, Carrick turned to the creature, nodding toward the direction of his ship. The larger creature, weary but determined, nudged its child forward, a silent acceptance of Carrick's offer. Together they moved across the barren landscape, an unlikely trio united by trust and survival. As they trudged onward, Carrick couldn't shake the feeling that this journey was about more than just survival. It was about redemption, about challenging the cruelty that had marked the lives of these creatures. In a universe filled with indifference, they had found an ally in each other. And as they made their way toward the uncertain future ahead, Carrick knew that this choice, this act of defiance, would echo far beyond the desolate landscape of Torvis III. Carrick moved with purpose, his eyes scanning the landscape as he led the creatures towards his ship. The larger one, despite its injuries, kept pace, and the smaller creature stayed close to its parent, wary but trusting in Carrick's guidance. The sense of urgency pushed him forward. He could feel the weight of responsibility in every step. Ahead lay not only the means to escape, but a challenge to circumvent orders that deemed these creatures irrelevant. In his mind, there was no question, they were coming with him. Every now and then, he glanced back at the creatures, ensuring they were keeping up. The parent seemed to draw on reserves of strength Carrick hadn't expected, pushing itself forward for the sake of the young one. The bond between them was undeniable, a fierce, unwavering loyalty that resonated deeply with him. It was a reminder that some connections, regardless of species, transcended logic. He respected that bond, feeling his resolve solidify with each step. They reached a ridge, giving Carrick a clear view of his ship in the distance. Relief washed over him, but it was brief. Movement caught his eye just beyond the ridge, shifting shadows that couldn't be natural. He tensed, his instincts alerting him to the presence of others. More Altan scouts, likely alerted by the skirmish earlier. Carrick cursed under his breath. The creatures had just found hope, and now another threat loomed. Glancing at his companions, he gestured for them to take cover. They understood, moving quietly behind a rock formation, their movements eerily synchronized. Carrick took a position nearby, readying his weapon. His mind worked rapidly, formulating a plan. It wasn't just about getting to his ship anymore. They'd have to do so without alerting the scouts or risking another confrontation. He peered over the rock, counting at least 3 Altan scouts scanning the terrain. They were close, too close for comfort. The creatures stayed low, their bodies tense but silent, understanding the stakes as well as he did. Carrick knew that any misstep could end this fragile alliance prematurely, and he couldn't afford that. His mission had taken on a new meaning, one that went far beyond protocol or personal safety. With careful precision, Carrick edged around the rocks, maneuvering into a position that gave him a line of sight on the scouts. He signaled to the larger creature, gesturing toward a path that would lead them closer to the ship, while he created a distraction. The creature's gaze met his, and in that instant, he knew it understood. Without hesitation, it began moving, leading its young along the path, their forms blending seamlessly into the shadows. Carrick shifted his stance, readying himself to engage. He moved quickly, his figure darting through the rocks as he fired a series of controlled shots, drawing the scouts' attention away from the creatures. The Altan responded immediately, their weapons firing in his direction, but he was already on the move, staying just out of their line of sight, luring them away from the path he'd marked for the creatures. His plan was working, but he knew he was playing a dangerous game. One wrong move could leave him exposed, and the creatures would be left vulnerable without his protection. After leading the scouts in a wide arc, Carrick paused, catching his breath as he checked the creatures' progress. They were almost at his ship, moving as quickly as their injured state allowed. Satisfaction bloomed in his chest. They'd made it this far, and his risky plan was paying off. But just as he prepared to rejoin them, a sharp pain seared through his side. One of the Altan had managed to get a shot in, grazing his ribs. Gritting his teeth, he pressed a hand to the wound, steadying himself. This was no time to falter. The pain served as a reminder of the stakes. He pushed forward, ignoring the throbbing ache, his focus returning to the creatures. They had paused at the entrance of his ship, the larger one waiting for him, unwilling to board without the human who had shown them unexpected kindness. Carrick forced a reassuring nod, waving them aboard before he darted around the final rock formation, evading the scouts just in time. He could feel his strength waning, but sheer determination drove him the last few steps, and he stumbled into the ship's interior, sealing the entrance behind him. Inside, he took a moment to catch his breath, leaning against the wall. The larger creature moved closer, its gaze fixed on his wound, a deep rumble emanating from its chest, concern, perhaps, or maybe just acknowledgement of his efforts. Either way, Carrick found himself comforted by its presence. They'd made it, but this was only the beginning. He'd defied orders, risked his life, and forged an alliance with creatures that the galaxy had deemed expendable. As he activated the ship's controls, he glanced back at them, noting the younger one's curious gaze, its eyes wide with a mixture of fear and wonder as it took in the strange interior. The parent remained steady, watching him with that same quiet understanding that had marked their first encounter. In that gaze, he saw more than gratitude. He saw recognition, a silent promise that they would not forget what he had done for them. With a few swift commands, the ship lifted off, breaking free from the barren planet's gravity. Carrick allowed himself a moment of relief, knowing that they were out of immediate danger. He set a course for a nearby outpost, where he could arrange medical attention for both himself and the creatures. It was risky. There would be questions, consequences for his actions. But he couldn't bring himself to care. Rules and regulations felt trivial compared to the lives he'd just saved. The journey was quiet, the only sound the hum of the engines and the soft, rhythmic breathing of the creatures as they rested, exhausted but safe. Carrick leaned back, letting the tension drain from his body as he reflected on the events that had brought them together. In a galaxy that often ignored the suffering of those deemed insignificant, he had chosen differently. He'd seen the life and spirit within these creatures, and he'd refused to let them be discarded. As the ship hurtled through space, Carrick felt a strange sense of purpose. This wasn't just a mission anymore. He'd broken protocol, sure, but in doing so, he'd found something worth fighting for. These creatures weren't just passengers. They were survivors, allies forged through shared trials. And as he looked at them, he couldn't help but wonder what lay ahead, what new paths this unlikely alliance would open. The larger creature's eyes met his once more, and he thought he saw a glint of understanding, perhaps even mutual respect. They were no longer strangers but comrades, each bound by the shared experience of survival, each strengthened by the other's presence. And in that unspoken bond, Carrick found a renewed sense of determination. He had defied the galaxy's indifference, and for that, he would face whatever consequences came his way. They were worth it.